My name's Mike McLaughlin, and let's just kind of jump into this. I want to set the stage here for what the next 15 to 20 minutes are going to be. So our goal is to provide disaster recovery as a service for on-prem vCenter workloads. And on the left side of the screen, I've got an example environment here running with an on-prem vCenter. And what we're going to do is basically deploy an SDDC, a vCenter in the cloud, and then use VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, fail a workload over into the cloud, and then we'll eventually fail it back as well. We don't want to just stay there. We want to find a two-way street. And so with that, what I want to do is jump into the demonstration. And I've got a recording here. Okay, we're starting off here. On the left side of the screen is a running vCenter. Small set of example that I could fit on the screen for you to look at here. And on the right is an empty vCenter, an SDDC running on VMC on AWS. And I've already deployed this. All right, so I've already taken, we'll get into the details on that a little bit later, but I've got a deployed SDDC because I was told disaster is coming. And I want to show you how simple it is to fail over to the cloud and become operational. And then once disaster is resolved, return to service. All right. So with that, let's take a look at what happens here behind this or on top of the scenes. I'm going to start by logging into my VMware Cloud Services portal. And you can see on the top here, I have my VMware Cloud on AWS component. That gives me my data center in the cloud. And I also have my VMware Cloud DR service. And that gives me my orchestration and my DR capabilities. So let's drill into that. This is the Orchestrator Dashboard. And you can see a couple of things on here, mostly green check marks. Towards the right side, there is a purple bubble, my DR SDDC. It's already been deployed. I'm just kind of looking here, but let's kind of get to the failover here. The first thing I like to do is make sure I have my SDDC, and we can see that it's already deployed. It's available here in my orchestrator, in my dashboard, so that I know I have a place to fail my workload over to. I have a DR plan. It's called Sample Application here. It's the top one in the list. And it's going from my data center site 1 to my DR SDDC. All right, and we can see that the plan looks good. It's ready to run. It's got a nice green check mark. My continuous compliance is ready to go. And so for sake of moving this forward, I'm going to go ahead and begin failover. All right, a couple of steps here. I'm going to use the latest snapshot. We'll talk about the deep archive later and basically just begin proceeding. Now, there's a number of steps that are going to happen here. All right, fairly simple set of steps. The first 5 is a recovery. Then at step 6, I've inserted a user confirmation. I like to put this in my plans as kind of a checkpoint. And if you saw, there's some migration steps there at the bottom. We'll get to those in just a moment, but let's get the failover started. I'm going to click failover, commit, and the orchestrator now takes over for me. All right, and we can see the plan begin to run. Step 1 is recovering the database. And drill into the details here if we want to. What's happening in the background, we'll look in just a moment, is my workload is being mounted from the scale-out file system. So let's go to our SDDC here. I can navigate there from the UI, and we can see that the database is already actually up and running. And the web server, the second step, is now being brought into inventory, reconfigured, getting ready. This is part of the live mount. This is essentially taking the virtual machine from the scale-out cloud file system and bringing it into inventory. No conversions, no restore operations. It's independent of the size, pretty much. I mean, we're basically bringing a VM into inventory, configuring it into the right location, and powering it on or not, depending on what the plan calls for. FS01 is a file server. It's just a virtual machine in one of my application spaces. We can see it kind of coming in and out of inventory here, but I've got the green triangle. So I'm going to go ahead. While we're still in a failover process here, I can begin working immediately on the application. So I'm going to log into my file server here. What I want to do is just create a little bit of data in the cloud while we're in this failover disaster recovery. You'll notice we've got a little snapshot thing there. We'll talk about that later. But let's just create some data in the cloud. I'm just going to copy a folder of data 3. We'll call it data 4 for sake of being creative. But it'll give us something to look for when we fail back on-prem. All right, so data 4 has been created in the cloud. Now, the important thing here to keep in mind is we're still failing over. The plan is still executing in the background, and I'm going to power on my desktop system here. This was actually chosen during failover not to turn on. It was left for the administrator. So I have power control, a number of things that I can do in the plan orchestration that make this a fairly simple yet robust solution for managing the failover of the applications. If we come back to the executing plan, here we are with our step here. This is the point that I put in to sort of synchronize things. And I want to just take a quick look and say, okay, I've got my database recovered. Everything looks good. I just was in the cloud working on stuff. So I think things are good to proceed. So let's go ahead with the rest of the failover. All right. And what we're going to do, this, like I said, this is an optional user confirmation. It's not required in the plan. I like to do it because it makes it easy to sort of pause for a moment. What's happening now is the virtual machines that were part of this recovery plan, they're already up and running in the cloud. They're already servicing workloads. I've already made changes. I'm now migrating those in the background. And I've sped this up a little bit because this takes a couple of minutes per virtual machine to do the vMotion in the background, but it's happening behind the scenes. All right, we get to a point now where the plan is done. We've finished executing this particular plan, and I have a commit button here, all right? And I can kind of look down at my steps here. I've got my virtual machines recovered. I have my user prompt for acknowledgement, and I've successfully migrated all the workloads from the live mount data store fully into the SDDC. So they're running in the SDDC on vSAN with the ultimate, the performance, speed, and protection that your SDDC provides you, all right? Let's go ahead and see what's going on here. I'm going to go ahead and commit this plan. All right, it's fairly simple. Commit failover. I may record a little note in here. This is going into the run book that we're going to get as a result of this particular action. All right. So plan is done. We can see the failover committed. I have an activate button, which we'll get to later when we want to restart this. But if we see here, the failover that just occurred in this demonstration took about 7 minutes total start to finish. Summary there. And right there on the right-hand side, I can create a PDF report. So I can download basically a run book of this particular failover. We're going to see a number of things later on of the information inside of VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery that helps me with this. My run book has a fair amount of detail in it. I'm going to just kind of scroll through this briefly, but we can see here plan summary, basically when it executed, how long it took, whether it was successfully completed. That's always a good sort of cover page for a run book. We can get down into the failover mappings. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail when we actually want to go construct an environment in VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. But this gives me all of the mappings that were used in the plan. The workflow steps, we can see my 6 steps here that we executed, the 5 failover and the 1 confirmation, and kind of scrolling through it. And I don't expect you to read all the details here. What I want to show you, though, is you've got a good summary report, a run book of this particular fairly simple application failover. And my favorite part's the error log at the end with no errors. It sounds like it's a good one. We'll file that one away, send it off to the boss, put it in the drawer, whatever. So we're now basically at the end. Our plan has failed over, a very simple one. It's only a couple of virtual machines, but I wanted to give you a feel for how simple this could be in a real environment. Now, I already had a couple of things already set up. We're going to get into sort of the homework that I had to do a little bit later. All right.
Is this all synchronous replication or async?
So the replication is snapshot based. We'll look at the schedules. In the one step where I was doing the failover, I had to pick a snapshot, and I took the latest snapshot. So that, think of that as an on-premises snapshot replicated to the cloud, and then the cycle repeats. So it's not synchronous replication to the cloud. It is asynchronous, and it is a point-in-time recovery point driven.
And how much time do I lose with the synchronization? So the RPO, what's the minimal that I would get out of it?
So with the current release, the RPOs that we're shooting for on the schedules are basically to 4 hours per plan. So I can basically have a 4-hour cycle that my schedules will run to, and that they could be daily, weekly. One of the key benefits, though, is I have a very deep archive which we'll look at in a little bit, where I can have weeks and months and even years of data in that scale out cloud file system for recovery options.
Okay, thanks.
The question is a bit more high level. What does DR as a service represent for VMware? Right now, we see that it is being made for this specific use case and product, but it is the direction that VMware is going towards for all of its product range.
So DR as a service, this kind of comes back to the how does this compare to some of the other solutions that VMware also has, is the idea with if you think about as a service, subscription models, on demand, that's definitely a roadmap direction that we're heading in. And this product, I think, kind of highlights some of that direction. All right. There are a number of other things that VMware does that aren't part of today's discussion that we could get into in an offline discussion.
So we've seen a lot of disaster recovery this week. What exactly is it that makes VMware's disaster recovery solution different from the competitors?
Well, I'd like to think it back to what Mark was saying is the solution one is as a service, which means as a customer, I'm familiar with my on-premises VMware environments. I've been running vCenter for years, all right? And if I want to have a simple, cost-effective, easy to manage, and reliable solution, and leverage the cloud to do that, so I can take advantage of some cloud economics. I know this sounds a little bit my marketing, but it really is. We're looking for something that is easy to set up, uses the cloud as a DR site, all right? So I don't have to have a secondary data center. So the advantages that we have is leveraging your existing on-prem VMware commitment and footprint, but yet giving you an option to easily deploy that in the cloud for DR and bring those workloads back, which is what we're going to do here in just a moment. But I think that the key things are cost, simplicity, and reliability. And those are things we're going to be covering over the next probably hour and a half in the presentations and in the demonstrations.
Let me add one more, Mike. So one is the instant RTO. So the challenge with generally doing a remote kind of backup and depending on that to do DR is that how long does it take to bring up your workloads in the cloud? If it takes days, then that's not really a disaster recovery solution. So that's also one of the key things. How quickly can I recover? Because ultimately, when there is a disaster, everybody's watching the admin saying when it's going to come up, and that's really important. How quickly can it come up? And also, because it's VMware on both sides, there is no conversion of VMs. A lot of solutions in the cloud, they convert your VMs into something else. And that's not what people really want in a disaster recovery solution.
Regarding how you guys are going about the live mount, I'm imagining that the OVA that we have deployed is not only serving as the gateway to do the copying of these snapshots in your 4-hour window increments, but also it's leveraging some method to do the mounting to a data store that, or the gateway for the data store that is available to vCenter via the object store. So if that's the case, when you're doing large deployments and you're trying to bring up a lot of VMs, or the VMs are very large, do you have to deploy multiple versions of the or multiple instances of this let's say proxy server, for lack of a better term, to order to minimize your recovery window so things come up faster? Got it.
So in the next section, I'll cover some of the file system details, and maybe I can also cover the questions you've asked.
And just to clarify, the connector is actually deployed in the protected site. The live mount is enabled via direct connectivity into the SDDC. So we'll get into that sort of architecture picture later on in the presentation as well. I also wanted to kind of just quickly address the RPO point. So today, minimum is 4 hours. If you kind of go and look at our roadmap, which is publicly available on our VMware Cloud and AWS website, you'll see that as part of our technology evolution outlook, we are also looking at lowering those RPOs in the future.
Let me just start into this, and if there's more questions, I may jump ahead in this one and kind of skip over some of the more mundane things that are happening. Okay. We just did the failover. On the left-hand side is our on-prem data center. I've highlighted in gray the virtual machines that were part of that sample application. They're running in the right-hand side. I've already changed data in the FS01 virtual machine. But if we want to fail back, what we're going to do is essentially go back to our dashboard, okay, our orchestrator here. We're going to go back to our DR plans. And I have a second plan in inventory here. It's the second one in the list. It's the fail back of a sample application. All right. And what we want to do is fail back from VMC, is bring that workload back. There's a couple of things that happen here that are fairly important to understand in the overall solution. So what we're going to do is begin this plan, and what you'll see is there's a lot more steps involved here. All right, it looks a little bit more daunting. That one that failed over had 5 steps. We've got a little bit more work to do to successfully bring all those changes cleanly back, because we don't know what happened when that disaster struck. All right, but we're going to kind of go through all this in just a moment. The key thing here is we're going to minimize the amount of data leaving the cloud to satisfy this and orchestrate this as much as possible so that essentially cleanup on-prem is handled for a large degree by the orchestrator. All right, so let's go ahead and start this failover. And what we'll see here, the first thing that's going to happen on the left-hand side, and you don't have to see all the details, but we're going to power off those virtual machines in our on-prem environment. They could have been left running. I mean, we don't know what their status is, but what we want to do is shut them down and then restore them to the same point in time that was used for the failover. So when we did the failover, we picked a particular point in time to establish the new working systems in the cloud. What we want to do is get the on-prem environment back to that point in time so that we can bring just the change blocks that occurred while we were operating in DR mode, while we were operating in the cloud. We want to bring just those change blocks back on-prem and restart that workload as if it had never left, as if it was still running in the cloud, for example. So we can see here, we're essentially restoring the virtual machines on-prem. We're going to go through, we're going to synthesize the snapshots out of the changes that occurred while they were operating in the cloud, and then bring that workload back on-prem. Now, I've sped this up a little bit because we don't necessarily need to watch each of these actions happening. They take a couple of minutes. It's not instantaneous. That's part of it. But we can see down here in the bottom left-hand side is when we actually get down to step 25, we're going to begin recovering the workload back on-prem. All right. And what I'm going to do is skip ahead a little bit on this so that we'll just kind of skip through these steps and we'll get down to the bottom here. And now we've got this prompt back in it for user input. What I want to do before I kind of say, go ahead, I'm back on-prem, I'm looking at my file server. I want to do just a real quick check that data 4 that I created in the cloud is actually here. All right, and as soon as I see that, we'll kind of skim through a little bit more of this particular product demonstration. There's one step at the end that's kind of critical for something I'm going to need to do later, and I kind of want to show you that. And then, so there we have data 4. That looks good. Let's go ahead and finish up the rest of this plan. All right, commit our results. All right, and then what I want to do here is at the very end, I'm going to come down and my SDDC is no longer needed. All right, disaster has been serviced. I'm going to go ahead and delete the SDDC, including everything that I put in the cloud, and basically relinquish my cloud compute footprint for DR. Now, I will have to build another one if I want to do testing or I need to fail over again. But what happens is in about 9 or 10 minutes of real time, my SDDC will be gone, and I'll be back to kind of a starting point where I could begin to enable DR to the cloud if I wanted to. So I sped this up. It's 4 minutes, 5.
Can I ask a quick question on that?
Sure.
So you said you're deleting the SDDC in the VMC
on AWS. Yep.
So as a customer, I'm only paying for the VMs that I replicate into the cloud.
As part of the disaster recovery solution, yes. As part of the services that entitle this whole solution. Remember when we looked at the dashboard and I had the two tiles, I had the VMC tile and the VMware Cloud DR tile in my services, those have costs associated with them. So what I want to make sure is when I have to spin up an SDDC, that I use that only for the amount of time that I need. And we'll talk a little bit later about having pilot life footprints and things like that. But we can see here now that purple bubble is gone.
But the VMC is the customers, or is it something that you run?
So there are two charges here, right? There's the charge for the DR as a service itself, right? And that's for the automation, the storage of the replicated copies, all the orchestration that Mike's been demonstrating. But you still have to pay for the failover capacity separately. And so therefore, we've really paid a lot of attention to try to optimize so that for a customer that wants the absolute lowest cost option, they only would spin up the failover capacity for running during a failover or only during the tests.
Capacity, and so that's what we mean is SDDC capacity.
The SDDC capacity, right? The VMC SDDC capacity, you do still have to pay for. And so in this design, you're only paying for it during testing or failover.
Yeah, but that's a minimum of free service. So if I'm a customer, I need to buy at least 3 VMC servers that I need to pay for as a customer, and then everything that comes onto it, and I'll take off of it. So my question is this something that customers would in the end use to migrate to VMC?
We do see some customers who, because of their business needs, they end up doing that. I wouldn't say that's the primary use case, right? In most cases, what we're seeing right now is that customers are using it for DR, and so they ultimately intend to fail back.
Okay.
But it is an option. Maybe they fail over and decide they're just going to stay there.
And just to clarify, there's the pilot light option where they could have that minimum 3-host footprint, but the solution also allows you to have 0-host footprint in the steady state, right? And there's some trade-offs there in terms of ease of use and recovery time. But you could have you could be paying for 0 hosts in the steady state, right? And only spin up those hosts on demand when you need to for DR testing and failover purposes.
Yeah, kind of like what's shown on the screen right now is I have no SDDC footprint right now. So if my arrangement with my service provider, I'm not paying for that right now.